Sometimes a man spends his whole life believing he's worth nothing, fighting just to survive another day. Thrain Emberhide knew that feeling, born with only a broken sword and the memory of a father who never returned. He fought as a mercenary, trading blood for bread, until the day he defeated a feared warlord and won an ancient mountain fort. While others celebrated, Thrain found a sealed door marked with strange symbols. Behind it lay a hidden chamber with ancient prophecies, and a shield bearing the same mark he'd carried on his skin since birth. What he discovered wasn't treasure, it was the truth about who he really was. The poor giant wasn't poor at all. He was the last heir to a bloodline that could unite or destroy every clan in the north. But what happens when a man discovers he was never meant to be poor? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like memories of old battles, and Thrain Emberhide stood at the edge of what had once been called Ironhold, a fortress carved into living rock by kings whose names were now whispered only in the oldest songs. The stone beneath his boots was worn smooth by centuries of weather and war, each crack telling a story of siege and surrender. At 35 winters, Thrain had the hands of a man who had known more calluses than comfort, and shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of other men's expectations. But those expectations had always been, lo, the broken sword at his hip, his father's only gift, caught the morning light like a promise half kept. The blade had snapped just above the crossguard sometime before Thrain's birth, leaving him with steel that could neither cut clean nor thrust true. A weapon for a man who was neither fully armed nor completely defenseless. It seemed fitting somehow. His entire life had been spent in that middle ground between something and nothing, still staring at rocks like they'll tell you secrets. Bjorn Ironwrist emerged from the keep's shadows, his own sword properly whole and properly sharpened. 20 years Thrain's senior, Bjorn had been the closest thing to a father figure the younger man had known, though even that relationship carried the careful distance of a man who had learned not to expect too much from anyone. Thrain turned, his pale green eyes reflecting the kind of weariness that came not from sleepless nights, but from sleepless years. Rocks have more to say than most men, old friend. They remember things we choose to forget. Bjorn snorted, but there was affection in it. Philosopher talk from a man who split Sigvur's skull 3 days past. The men still can't believe it. Neither can I, if I'm being honest. The victory over Sigvur the Twice-Blooded had surprised everyone, including Thrain himself. The warlord had ruled these northern reaches for a decade, demanding tribute from every village within a week's ride of his mountain stronghold. His reputation had been built on the bodies of men who thought they could challenge him, men with better weapons, better armor, and certainly better bloodlines than a bastard mercenary with a broken sword. But reputation meant little when steel met steel and will met will. Sometimes the mountain doesn't ask if you're ready to climb it, Thrain said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had learned to find wisdom in simple truths. It just stands there, waiting to see if you'll try. The battle had lasted from dawn until the sun reached its highest point. Sigvur had been everything the stories claimed, brutal, cunning, and strong enough to cleave a man in two with a single stroke. But he had also been everything Thrain had expected him to be, and expectation was a kind of preparation all its own. When Sigvur raised his great axe for the killing blow, Thrain had been ready. The broken sword might not cut clean, but it could still find the gap between helm and mail, still slide between ribs if guided by desperation, and 35 years of learning how to survive when survival should have been impossible. Now Ironhold was his, along with the 37 men who had sworn themselves to Sigvur's service. They were a rough collection, displaced farmers, landless warriors, and men who had found themselves on the wrong side of clan feuds. Not the finest company a lord might keep, but they were honest in their dishonesty, and they had sworn new oaths readily enough once they saw how their former master looked with steel through his throat. "The men want to know your plans," Bjorn continued. settling his considerable weight against the stone parapet. This place hasn't seen proper lordship in 3 generations. The walls need mending, the stores need filling, and winter's not far off. Thrain nodded, though his attention seemed drawn to something beyond the immediate concerns of leadership. They'll have their answer soon enough. First, I need to understand what it is I've truly won here. The fortress of Ironhold had been built into the mountainside like a growth of the stone itself. 3 levels carved directly into the rock face, with walls that seemed to blend seamlessly from worked stone to natural cliff. The lowest level housed the barracks, armory, and great hall, where Sigvor had once held court. The middle level contained private chambers and storage rooms that still held the musty scent of disuse. But it was the uppermost level that drew Thrain's curiosity, chambers that had been sealed when Sigvor took the fortress, rooms that the warlord had declared off-limits to all but himself. Strange thing, Bjorn mused, following Thrain's gaze upward, how Sigvor never much cared for the old king's quarters, slept in the great hall most nights, said the upper chambers gave him dark dreams, and yet he kept them sealed rather than open them to light and air. Aye, said some doors were better left closed. Thrain touched the pommel of his broken sword, a habit he'd developed in moments of deep thought. The metal was warm under his palm, heated by the morning sun, but sometimes, just sometimes, it seemed to pulse with its own warmth, as if something slept within the steel itself. He had never mentioned this to anyone, not even Bjorn. A man who talked about magical swords was a man who invited questions about his fitness to lead, but the warmth was there nonetheless. "Tell me about the old kings," Thrain said. "The ones who built this place." Bjorn scratched his greying beard, his eyes growing distant with the effort of memory. "Before my time, that. But my grandfather spoke of them sometimes, when the ale was flowing and the night was deep. Called themselves the Dragonkin, claimed descent from the first men to tame the great worms of the northern ice. Proud folk by all accounts. Powerful too. What happened to them? Same thing that happens to all proud folk eventually. They forgot that power shared is power kept, and power hoarded is power lost. The last of their line died young. No heirs, no kin willing to claim the throne. The clans picked the bones clean, and Ironhold stood empty for near 70 years before Sigvor decided it suited his purposes. Thrain absorbed this history like a man drinking from a well after days in the desert. He had never known his own family's story, never had tales of grandfathers or great deeds to warm him through cold nights. His earliest memory was of waking in a fishing village, clutching the broken sword and wearing clothes too large for his child's frame. The villagers had fed him and given him shelter, but they had also made it clear that charity was temporary, and work was the price of continued kindness. By 10 winters, he had been hauling nets and mending sails. By 15, he had grown large enough to swing an axe or wield a hammer with real effect. By 20, he had taken the warrior's path, hiring his sword to anyone who could pay, and learning that reputation was built one fight at a time. One victory at a time, one day of staying alive at a time. It had been a hard education, but a thorough one. "The men are gathered in the hall," Bjorn said, after a comfortable silence had stretched between them. "They're eager to hear what manner of lord they've found themselves serving." Thrain straightened, pushing away from the wall and the weight of old thoughts. "Then let's not keep them waiting." A man's first speech as lord sets the tone for everything that follows. They made their way down through the fortress, their footsteps echoing in corridors that still held the scent of old battles and older fears. The great hall of Ironhold was a vast chamber carved from the living rock, its ceiling supported by pillars that had been shaped to look like great trees frozen in stone. Ancient banners hung from the walls, most so faded that their original colors were lost to time, though a few still showed hints of the dragon motifs that had once marked this as a seat of the Dragonkin dynasty. The 37 men who now called Thrain Lord were gathered around the great hearth, their faces a mixture of curiosity and careful neutrality. These were men who had learned to read the wind before it changed, to judge a leader's mettle before committing themselves too deeply to his cause. They had followed Sigvur because he was strong and paid regularly. They would follow Thrain for the same reasons, if he proved worthy of their service. "Men of Ironhold," Thrain began, his voice carrying easily through the chamber without strain or artifice. 3 days ago, you served a lord who took what he wanted and kept what he could. Today, you serve a lord who knows what it means to have nothing and lose even that. A murmur ran through the assembled warriors, interest rather than disapproval. These were men who understood hardship, who knew the taste of lean times and empty bellies. "I won't lie to you with promises of easy wealth or bloodless victories," Thrain continued. "Winter comes whether we're ready or not, and this fortress needs work before the snows fall. But I'll tell you this, every man here will have a place at my table, a share in whatever fortune we make, and the right to speak his mind without fear of my displeasure." One of the younger warriors, a sandy-haired youth called Eric, who still had the soft look of a farmer's son about him, raised his hand tentatively. "My lord, what of the clans? Sigvur had arrangements with most of them, tribute agreements and such. Will those continue?" Thrain considered the question, his pale green eyes moving from face to face, reading the concern there. "A wise question, Eric. No, those arrangements will not continue. A lord who demands tribute from his neighbors is a lord who admits he cannot provide for his own people through honest work." This sparked more murmuring, some of it less comfortable than before. Tribute had been a steady source of income under Sigvur's rule, and these men had grown accustomed to its reliability. "Instead," Thrain said, raising his voice slightly to cut through the discussion, "we'll offer our services honestly. There's always work for men willing to protect merchant caravans, guard harvest festivals, or help settle disputes between rival families. We'll earn our silver the same way you've earned your scars, through skill and honest effort." Bjorn stepped forward, his weathered face creasing into something that might have been approval. "And what of leadership among the men?" "Sigvur had his captains, his trusted few. Any man who proves himself worthy of trust will have it," Thrain replied without hesitation. "I'll judge you by your actions, not by the oaths you swore to dead lords or the mistakes you made before you came here. We all start fresh when the sun rises tomorrow." The response to this was more positive, nods and exchanged glances that spoke of relief rather than concern. These were men who had made their share of mistakes, who understood the value of second chances and fresh starts. As the gathering began to break up, with men heading off to their duties or their rest, Thrain found himself studying the faded banners on the walls more closely. The dragon motifs were crude by the standards of southern artisans, but there was something about them that caught his attention. The dragons weren't depicted as monsters or beasts to be feared, but as partners, companions to the human figures that rode upon their backs or stood beside them. "Strange way to show dragons," he murmured to himself. Bjorn, who had been organizing the evening's watch assignments, looked up.
"What's that?"
"These banners. Most places, dragons are shown as enemies, creatures to be slain by heroes. Here they look almost friendly. Aye, that's the old way of seeing things. Before men forgot how to speak to the great beasts. Before fear replaced understanding." Bjorn's voice carried the weight of old stories, half-remembered truths passed down through generations of fireside tales. "My grandfather used to say the first dragonkin didn't conquer the dragons. They befriended them, made pacts with them, learned from them." Thrain felt something stir within him, a recognition he couldn't quite name. And what happened to those pacts? "Same thing that happens to all pacts between the proud and the powerful," Bjorn said with a shrug. "They got forgotten when it was convenient to forget them, and remembered when it was too late to mend them." As the evening shadows began to creep across the great hall, Thrain found himself alone with his thoughts and the weight of unexpected lordship. He had spent his entire life following other men's orders, fighting other men's battles, living by other men's rules. Now suddenly, he was the one who made the rules, the one whose decisions would determine whether these 37 souls prospered or perished through the coming winter. It was a responsibility he had never asked for, but one he would not shy away from. The broken sword at his hip seemed to pulse with that strange warmth again, as if approving of his resolve. The sealed door waited in the uppermost level of Ironhold like a secret that had grown heavy with age. Thrain had discovered it on his second day as lord, while exploring the chambers that Sigvur had kept locked away from prying eyes. Most of the upper rooms held nothing more than dust-covered furniture and moth-eaten tapestries, but this particular chamber had stopped him cold. The door itself was unlike anything he had ever seen. Instead of wood bound with iron, it was carved from a single piece of black stone, perfectly round and fitted so precisely into the circular opening that no gap showed between door and frame. But it was the symbol etched deep into its surface that made Thrain's breath catch in his throat, a stylized dragon wrapped around a sword, its tail forming a perfect circle that enclosed both blade and beast, the same mark that had been burned into his left shoulder since birth. Thrain stood before the door now, 3 days after his victory over Sigvur, studying the symbol by torchlight. The mark on his shoulder tingled, with a warmth that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. He had always assumed the birthmark was nothing more than a quirk of nature, a random pattern of darker skin that meant nothing to anyone but the village healers, who had proclaimed it unusual but harmless when he was still a child. Now, staring at its perfect twin carved in stone, he began to wonder if the healers had been wrong about more than just its significance. The broken sword at his hip grew warm against his leg, the metal heating as if it had been pulled fresh from a forge. Thrain drew the blade, studying its shattered edge in the flickering torchlight. The steel seemed to shimmer, and for just a moment, so brief he might have imagined it, the broken blade appeared whole again, gleaming with inner fire. He blinked, and it was broken once more. "My lord?" Bjorn's voice echoed up the stone stairway, accompanied by the heavy tread of boots on carved steps. "The evening meal is ready, and the men are asking after you." Thrain slid the sword back into its sheath, the warmth fading as the blade disappeared from view. "Coming, old friend. Just exploring our new home." But as he turned to leave, his calloused palm pressed flat against the stone door's surface, just below the carved dragon symbol. The stone was cold beneath his touch, but something stirred within it, a vibration so faint he felt it more than heard it. Like the distant rumble of thunder from a storm still beyond the horizon, the mark on his shoulder blazed with sudden heat, and the door moved, not opened, moved. The entire stone disc rotated a quarter turn, with a grinding sound like the earth itself shifting in its sleep. Ancient mechanisms, hidden within the mountain's bones, groaned to life after what must have been decades of stillness. Dust and small stones rained from the ceiling as the fortress seemed to shudder around him. Then, silence. Thrain stared at the door, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird, desperate for freedom. The dragon and sword symbol had rotated with the door, but now it seemed different somehow. The dragon's eye, which had been closed in the original carving, now appeared to be watching him with stone-carved intensity. "My lord!" Bjorn's voice was closer now, edged with concern. "What was that sound? Is everything all right up there?" "Fine," Thrain called back, though his voice came out rougher than he intended. "Just knocked over some old furniture. I'll be down shortly." He waited until Bjorn's footsteps retreated before approaching the door again. This time, when he pressed his palm to the stone, nothing happened. The door remained stubbornly closed, giving no sign that it had moved at all. But the dragon's eye definitely looked different now, alert where it had been sleeping, aware where it had been merely decorative. Thrain tried pushing against the door, pressing his full weight against the stone disc. It might as well have been the mountain itself for all the give it showed. He tried gripping the edges and pulling, tried searching for hidden levers or pressure points, tried everything his mind could conceive of, short of attacking it with an axe. Nothing. The door had moved once, when he wasn't trying to make it move. Now when he desperately wanted it to open, it remained as immovable as death itself. "Patience," he murmured to himself, though patience had never been his strongest virtue. "Whatever this is, it's waited this long. It can wait a little longer." But even as he spoke the words, Thrain knew they were false comfort. The discovery of that symbol, the matching of his birthmark to something carved in stone by hands that had been dust for generations, this changed everything. It meant his abandonment as a child hadn't been random. It meant the broken sword wasn't just a relic of some forgotten battle. It meant he had a history, a connection to something larger than the day-to-day struggle of survival that had defined his entire existence. The question was whether that history would prove to be a blessing or a curse. The evening meal in the great hall was a subdued affair. The men ate their stew and bread with the mechanical efficiency of warriors who had learned to take sustenance when it was available. But their eyes kept drifting to their new lord's face, reading the signs of distraction there. Thrain answered questions when asked, made decisions when required, but his mind remained fixed on the sealed door and its impossible symbol. "You look like a man who's seen a ghost," Bjorn observed quietly, settling his bulk onto the bench beside Thrain. "Or found something he wasn't expecting to find." Thrain considered his words carefully. These men had sworn themselves to his service, but loyalty was a fragile thing, easily shattered by doubts about a leader's judgment or fitness for command. Talk of mysterious doors and magical birthmarks would do little to inspire confidence in his practical abilities. "Just thinking about winter preparations," he said finally. "This fortress has been neglected for too long. There's more work to be done than I initially realized." It wasn't entirely a lie. The upper chambers had shown clear signs of long neglect, and the sealed door itself suggested secrets that Sigvur had either been unable or unwilling to confront. But it wasn't the whole truth either, and Bjorn's weathered face suggested he knew there was more to the story. "If you need help with anything at all, you only need to ask," the older warrior said. "I've been in these mountains longer than most, seen things that don't fit easily into songs or stories. Whatever's troubling you, there's likely someone here who's encountered something similar." Thrain nodded. Though he doubted any of these men had discovered their childhood birthmarks carved into ancient stone doors. Still, the offer was genuine, and he appreciated the gesture more than he could easily express. "I'll remember that, old friend. Thank you." As the evening wore on, and the men began to drift away to their rest or their watch duties, Thrain found himself studying the faded banners on the walls with new intensity. The dragon motifs that had seemed merely decorative before now carried weight and meaning. The creatures depicted there weren't just symbols of power or heraldic devices, they were portraits, memories captured in thread and dye, and in every banner, the dragons bore the same circular mark somewhere on their forms. Sometimes it appeared as a pattern in their scales, sometimes as a medallion hanging from their necks, sometimes as a crown or circlet adorning their great heads. But it was always there, always the same symbol that marked both the sealed door and Thrain's own flesh. "The old bloodline," he whispered to himself, the words carrying more certainty than he felt. "I'm connected to them somehow, to the dragonkin." But connection was not understanding, and understanding was what he needed most. The sealed door held answers, he was certain of that, but it had opened once through accident or instinct, and he had no idea how to make it happen again. Every moment he delayed was another moment of uncertainty, another hour of carrying questions that grew heavier with each passing thought. Rising from the great table, Thrain made his decision. The evening meal was finished, the men were settling into their routines, and the fortress was as quiet as it would be until dawn. If the door would open for him, it would open now. In the deep hours, when old magic was said to be strongest, he climbed the stone stairs to the upper level with the measured pace of a man walking toward his destiny. Whether that destiny proved to be glory or doom, the broken sword at his hip seemed to grow warmer with each step, and the mark on his shoulder tingled like a living thing awakening from long sleep. The sealed door waited exactly as he had left it, the carved dragon's eye seeming to track his movement as he approached. This time, Thrain didn't hesitate or overthink. He simply pressed his palm flat against the stone, directly over the dragon's head and spoke the words that seemed to rise from some deep place within his memory. "I am here," he said quietly. "I have come home." The door began to turn. The ancient stone door ground open, with the sound of mountains shifting, revealing darkness that seemed to breathe with its own rhythm. Cool air flowed from the hidden chamber beyond, carrying scents of old parchment, preserved leather, and something else, something that made the hairs on Thrain's arms stand upright with recognition he couldn't name. He hesitated at the threshold, torch raised high, peering into shadows that had remained undisturbed for longer than any living man could remember. The chamber beyond was vast, its walls disappearing into darkness beyond the reach of his flickering light. But what he could see made his breath catch in his throat. Carved directly into the living rock of the mountain were symbols, words, and images that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. The writing was in the old tongue, older than the common speech of the northern clans, but somehow, impossibly, Thrain found he could read it. The knowledge flowed into his mind, like water filling an empty vessel, as if the letters themselves were teaching him their meaning as his eyes traced their ancient forms. "Here lies the truth of the first compact," read the inscription nearest the doorway. "Here rest the words that bound dragon to man, man to dragon. In the age when both were young and the world was full of wonders yet to be discovered." Thrain stepped forward, his boots echoing in the vast chamber. The torch flame seemed to grow brighter here, as if the very air was eager to illuminate the secrets that had waited so long in darkness. As he moved deeper into the room, more inscriptions became visible, telling a story that rewrote everything he thought he knew about the world. The Dragonkin had not been merely a dynasty of kings who used dragons as symbols of their power. They had been something far more extraordinary, humans who had formed genuine partnerships with the great worms of the north, sharing knowledge, wisdom, and purpose in ways that defied the modern understanding of both species. In the year of the joining, another inscription read, "Eitri Dragonheart spoke the words of binding with Skovrandir the Wise, and their pact became the foundation upon which all future alliances would rest. Let it be known that dragon and human are not master and servant, but equals in the great work of protecting the balance between order and chaos." The deeper Thrain ventured into the chamber, the more elaborate the carvings became. Whole sections of wall were devoted to detailed images of humans and dragons working together, not in battle, but in acts of creation and preservation. Dragons breathing controlled fire to forge metals that could not be shaped by ordinary flames. Humans using dragon-taught magic to heal wounds that would otherwise prove fatal. Together, both species weaving protections around sacred places, ensuring that the balance between the natural and supernatural worlds remained stable. And in every image, the humans bore the same circular mark that decorated Thrain's shoulder, the symbol of the covenant between dragon and man, but it was what waited at the chamber's heart that truly stole his breath. A shield rested on a pedestal of carved stone, its surface gleaming despite the centuries that had passed since human hands last touched it. The metal was unlike anything Thrain had ever seen, not iron or steel, but something that seemed to capture and hold light within its crystalline structure. Etched into the shield's face was the familiar dragon and sword symbol, but here it was rendered with such artistry and precision that it seemed almost alive. Surrounding the pedestal were dozens of weapons, swords, axes, spears, and tools whose purposes he could only guess at. All bore the same distinctive metallic sheen. All were marked with symbols that matched those carved into the walls. But it was the sword that drew his attention most powerfully. A blade that lay beside the shield like a faithful guardian waiting for its master's return. The sword was whole, not just intact, but perfect in every detail, from the graceful curve of its crossguard to the intricate spirals that decorated its fuller. And as Thrain approached, he realized with growing certainty that this weapon was the twin to his own broken blade. The proportions were identical, the design elements perfectly matched. This was what his father's sword had looked like before whatever tragedy had shattered it so completely. With trembling hands, Thrain reached for the intact weapon. The moment his fingers closed around its grip, the chamber erupted with soft blue-white light. Every carved symbol, every inscription, every image on the walls began to glow with gentle radiance that made the torch in his other hand seem crude and unnecessary. And in that moment of illumination, Thrain understood that he was not just discovering ancient artifacts. He was coming home to a heritage that had been waiting for him to claim it. The sword felt perfect in his hand, balanced and responsive in a way that his broken blade had never been. When he drew his father's shattered weapon for comparison, the two pieces of metal seemed to sing to each other, harmonizing like voices that had been separated too long. The broken sword grew warm, then hot, then began to glow with the same blue-white radiance that filled the chamber. Before his eyes, the shattered blade began to mend itself. Metal flowed like liquid fire, gaps closing, edges smoothing, until the broken sword was broken no more. In his left hand, he held the ancient weapon from the chamber. In his right, he held its perfectly restored twin. Both blades hummed with power that seemed eager to be put to proper use, but with understanding came responsibility, and with power came the weight of choice. The inscriptions on the walls told of great works accomplished through the partnership of dragon and human, but they also spoke of great dangers that required such partnership to contain. The dragonkin had not simply ruled because they were strong, they had ruled because they were necessary. The only force capable of maintaining the delicate balance that kept darker powers in check. "The blood remembers," read one inscription, positioned directly above the pedestal where he had found the shield. Though generations pass and the compact seems forgotten, the blood remembers. When the need is greatest, when the darkness rises once more, the blood will call to blood, and the ancient partnership will be renewed. Thrain lowered both swords, his mind reeling with implications he was only beginning to grasp. He was not just the heir to a forgotten dynasty, he was the inheritor of responsibilities that stretched back centuries, the keeper of knowledge that could reshape the balance of power throughout the northern lands. But knowledge without wisdom was dangerous, and power without understanding could destroy as easily as it could protect. The chamber held more secrets than he could absorb in a single night, more history than he could fully comprehend without years of study. Yet even as he acknowledged his limitations, Thrain felt a deep certainty settling into his bones. This was why he had survived when he should have died. This was why he had been abandoned as a child, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity, hidden away until the time came for him to reclaim his birthright. This was why the broken sword had grown warm in his hands, why the sealed door had opened to his touch, why everything in his life had led him to this moment in this hidden chamber beneath an ancient fortress. He was the last of the dragonkin, and the world was about to remember what that meant. The twin swords felt like extensions of his own arms as he lifted them again, studying their perfect edges in the chamber's mystical light. Whatever trials lay ahead, whatever enemies would rise to challenge the return of the old bloodline, he would face them with weapons forged by dragons and wielded by kings. The broken sword was broken no more, and neither was the man who carried it. But even as confidence filled him, questions remained. Where were the dragons now? How could he honor a compact made with creatures that seemed to have vanished from the world? And what enemies would emerge from the shadows once word spread that the dragonkin had returned? The chamber held many answers, but it also promised many more questions. Thrain had found his heritage, but now he had to learn how to live up to it. Dawn found Thrain still in the hidden chamber, seated cross-legged before the ancient inscriptions with both swords laid across his knees. He had spent the night reading the walls like a scholar discovering the world's first library, absorbing knowledge that both thrilled and terrified him in equal measure. The mystical light had dimmed with the coming of day, but the symbols remained visible enough to study, and each new passage he deciphered. added weight to the responsibility settling on his shoulders. The sound of heavy boots on stone announced Bjorn's approach long before. The older warrior appeared in the doorway. His weathered face showed the kind of careful neutrality that came from years of dealing with lords who might react poorly to questions about their whereabouts. "My lord," Bjorn said quietly, his eyes taking in the glowing chamber, the ancient weapons, and Thrain's transformation from practical mercenary to something that seemed touched by older powers. "The men are asking after you. There's been no word since yesterday evening, and some are beginning to worry." Thrain looked up from a particularly complex inscription dealing with the proper rituals for summoning dragon allies. In the morning light filtering down from the upper chambers, Bjorn looked older than his years, more worn by the weight of constant vigilance. It struck Thrain that his old friend had probably spent the night worrying about his lord's mental state rather than getting the rest he deserved. "I'm well." "Bjorn, better than well, actually." Thrain rose smoothly, the twin swords moving with him as if they were natural extensions of his body. "But I suspect the men won't find that particularly reassuring when they see these." He gestured to the restored blades, their edges catching the chamber's remaining mystical light. Even dimmed, the weapons were clearly extraordinary, too perfect, too balanced, too obviously touched by powers that went beyond mortal craftsmanship. Bjorn's eyes widened as he took in the sight of the mended sword. He had been present when Thrain first arrived in the northern lands, had seen the broken blade countless times over the years they had fought together. There was no mistaking what had happened here. Even if the how and why remained beyond normal understanding, "The blade," Bjorn said slowly, "it's whole again." Among other things, Thrain sheathed both weapons, though their weight felt strange after a lifetime of carrying only one incomplete sword. "I've learned some things about this fortress, about the family that built it, about myself, and those things would be..." Thrain considered how much to reveal, how much truth his men could handle without losing faith in their lord's judgment. The full story, dragon partnerships, mystical bloodlines, ancient compacts, would sound like the ravings of a man who had spent too much time alone with old legends. But some explanation was necessary, if only to prepare them for the changes that were coming. "The Dragonkin weren't just another royal dynasty," he said finally. "They were something more, something that connected them to powers most men don't even believe in anymore. And apparently I'm the last heir to their bloodline." Bjorn absorbed this information with the pragmatic calm of a man who had seen enough strange things in his life to know that the world was larger and more mysterious than most people suspected. "That explains the birthmark," he said after a moment. "And why the chamber opened for you. You're taking this remarkably well. My lord, I've followed you into battle against men twice your size and seen you walk away from fights that should have killed you a dozen times over. I've watched you make decisions that somehow always turn out right, even when they seemed foolish at the time. If you tell me you're the heir to an ancient bloodline with mystical powers, I'm inclined to believe you've simply discovered something that was always true." The simple acceptance in Bjorn's voice was both reassuring and humbling. Thrain had expected doubt, questions, perhaps even suspicion about his mental state. Instead, he found the kind of loyalty that went beyond mere oath-keeping into something approaching faith. "The men will need time to adjust," Thrain said. "This changes things in ways I'm only beginning to understand myself." "What kind of changes?" Thrain moved to the wall where the most detailed inscriptions were carved, running his fingers along lines of text that described the true nature of the Dragonkin's responsibilities. "We can't just be another band of mercenaries anymore. According to these writings, the bloodline comes with obligations, duties to maintain balance, to protect certain sacred sites, to watch for signs of darkness rising. And if we refuse those obligations, then eventually someone or something else will rise to fill the vacuum we leave behind. And based on what I've read here, that someone will likely be far less concerned with the welfare of common folk than we are." Bjorn studied the inscriptions himself, though the ancient script remained meaningless to his eyes. So we become guardians instead of sellswords, protectors instead of hired killers. I've known worse fates for a man to meet. It won't be that simple, Thrain warned. There will be those who remember the old bloodline, who have reasons to want it to stay extinct, and there will be others who try to use us for their own purposes once word spreads about what we've become. Let them come, Bjorn said with grim satisfaction. We've handled worse odds before. But even as his old friend spoke with characteristic confidence, Thrain could see the questions forming behind his eyes. How did one fight enemies that might not be entirely human? What did it mean to partner with dragons that seemed to have vanished from the world? How could 37 warriors hope to fulfill responsibilities that had once required an entire dynasty to manage? These were the same questions that had kept Thrain awake through the night, studying inscription after inscription in search of practical guidance. The chamber held vast stores of knowledge about the history and philosophy of the dragonkin, but precious little information about how a single man was supposed to restart a tradition that had been dead for 3 generations. There's something else, Thrain said, moving to a section of wall he had only discovered as the mystical light began to fade. According to these writings, the bloodline isn't just about heritage, it's about capability. The dragonkin could do things that ordinary men cannot. What kind of things? Thrain placed his palm flat against a carved symbol, concentrating on the warmth that seemed to flow between his skin and the ancient stone. The symbol began to glow, softly at first, then with increasing intensity until it cast shadows throughout the chamber. When he lifted his hand, the light remained steady and bright. Things like that, he said quietly. Bjorn stared at the glowing symbol for a long moment before speaking. The men are going to have some very interesting reactions to this news, which is why we're going to introduce them to it gradually. No sense overwhelming them all at once. Thrain touched the symbol again, and the light faded back to darkness. For now, they need to know that I've discovered my heritage, and that it comes with both power and responsibility. The details can wait until they've had time to adjust to the idea. And the swords. I'll carry both openly. Let them see that something significant has changed, but not overwhelm them with explanations they're not ready to hear. As they prepared to leave the chamber, Thrain took one last look at the inscriptions that had revealed so much about his true nature. Tomorrow he would return to continue his studies, to delve deeper into the knowledge that had been preserved here for his eventual discovery. But today he had a more immediate challenge to face. He had to figure out how to be a lord who was also something more than a lord, a guardian of ancient traditions, a keeper of mystical knowledge, and possibly the last hope for maintaining a balance that most people didn't even know existed. The twin swords felt heavier as he walked toward the doorway, weighted not just with metal but with destiny. The revelation of Thrain's heritage sent ripples through the small community of Ironhold, like stones dropped into still water. Word spread quickly among the 37 warriors, first as whispered speculation, then as guarded observation, and finally as cautious acceptance mixed with healthy apprehension. Men who had sworn themselves to a practical mercenary captain now found themselves serving something approaching a mythical figure. The reaction varied by temperament and experience. The younger warriors like Eric approached the situation with the adaptability of youth, fascinated by the idea of serving a lord with genuine magical abilities. The older men, scarred by years of disappointment and betrayal, watched and waited to see what Thrain's transformation would mean for their daily lives and winter survival. But it was the middle-aged, veterans who posed the greatest challenge, men old enough to have heard their grandfather's stories about the dragonkin, yet young enough to remember the harsh reality of life after the old bloodline's extinction. They had grown up in a world where magic was something that happened to other people in distant places, and the sudden proximity of genuine power made them nervous in ways they struggled to articulate. Thrain understood their discomfort because he shared it. 3 days ago, he had been one of them, a practical man dealing with practical problems through practical solutions. Now he found himself studying ancient texts by mystical light, carrying weapons that hummed with otherworldly power, and grappling with responsibilities that stretched back centuries. The morning after his conversation with Bjorn, Thrain called the men together in the great hall to address their concerns directly. He stood before the great hearth with both swords visible at his sides, the restored blade drawing every eye in the room. The contrast between the two weapons was subtle but unmistakable. One showed the honest wear of years of hard use, while the other gleamed with the perfection of something touched by forces beyond mortal understanding. "I know you have questions," Thrain began, his voice carrying the same steady confidence that had marked his leadership from the beginning. "And you deserve honest answers, even if those answers challenge what we thought we knew about the world." A grizzled warrior named Gunnar, one of Sigvur's former captains who had sworn new allegiance readily enough, raised a scarred hand. "My lord, the men are saying you found treasure in the sealed chambers. Gold and jewels from the old kings." "No gold," Thrain replied. "No jewels. What I found was knowledge, and the means to use it properly." He drew the restored sword, holding it up so the blade caught the morning light streaming through the hall's narrow windows. "This weapon was broken when my father carried it. In the hidden chamber, I learned how to make it whole again." "Magic, then," said another voice from the back of the group. It wasn't quite a question, but it carried enough uncertainty to demand clarification. "Call it what you will," Thrain said. "The important thing is what it means for all of us. We have the chance to be more than just another band of mercenaries scrambling for silver. We can be guardians, protectors of something larger than ourselves." "Protectors of what?" Eric asked, his young face bright with curiosity. Thrain had spent considerable time considering how to answer this question without overwhelming them with concepts they weren't ready to accept. The full truth: dragon partnerships, mystical compacts, ancient responsibilities for maintaining cosmic balance, would sound like the fantasies of a man who had spent too much time alone with old books. "There are places in these mountains that require watching," he said carefully. "Sacred sites, ancient strongholds, crossroads where different kinds of power meet and sometimes clash. The Dragonkin were charged with keeping those places safe, ensuring that what should stay hidden remains hidden, and what should be protected stays protected. And now you're the last of their line," Bjorn added, his weathered face showing the kind of calm acceptance that helped anchor the group's more volatile reactions. "Which means those responsibilities fall to you." "To us," Thrain corrected. "I can't fulfill these obligations alone. I'll need men I can trust, warriors who understand that some battles are worth fighting even when there's no immediate profit in victory." This sparked a murmur of discussion among the assembled warriors. These were practical men who had learned to judge proposals by their likely outcomes, and the idea of fighting battles with no clear material reward challenged their basic assumptions about how the world worked. But it was old Gunnar who spoke the thought that several others were clearly wrestling with. "My lord, what you're describing sounds like the kind of work that gets men killed for causes they don't fully understand. How do we know this ancient knowledge you've found is worth dying for?" It was a fair question, one that Thrain had been asking himself since the moment he first touched the glowing wall symbols. The answer came not from the ancient inscriptions he had studied, but from something deeper, a certainty that seemed to rise from the same place within him that had always known when a fight was worth having. "Because," Thrain said slowly, "the alternative is to let darkness spread unchecked while good men convince themselves that it's someone else's responsibility to stop it." He sheathed the restored sword and moved closer to the group, close enough to meet each man's eyes individually. "I'm not asking anyone to follow me blindly into danger. I'm asking you to help me learn what these responsibilities really mean, to discover together what it looks like to be guardians instead of just survivors. And if we refuse," asked a lean warrior named Magnus, one of the more cautious voices among Sigvur's former followers, "then you're free to leave with my blessing and a fair share of whatever wealth this fortress contains." Thrain replied without hesitation. "I won't hold any man to oath sworn before he understood what he was swearing to." The honesty of this offer seemed to surprise several of the warriors. Most lords would have demanded absolute loyalty regardless of changing circumstances, would have treated departure as betrayal worthy of punishment. But Thrain's willingness to release them from their bonds paradoxically strengthened their inclination to stay. What kind of enemies are we likely to face? Bjorn asked, moving the conversation toward practical concerns. I'm still learning that myself, Thrain admitted. The chamber holds more knowledge than I can absorb quickly, but from what I've read so far, there are things in the deep places of the world that regard human civilization as an obstacle to be removed. Powers that were bound by the old compacts and may be stirring now that those bindings have weakened. Things, repeated Eric, with the particular fascination that young men reserve for dangerous mysteries. What kind of things? Thrain thought of the inscriptions he had studied by mystical light, descriptions of creatures that existed in the spaces between legend and nightmare, beings that feed on fear and chaos, that grow stronger when communities turn against each other. Ancient spirits that regard the current age as a temporary interruption in their rightful dominion over the world. And dragons? Gunnar asked. The old stories always talked about the dragonkin riding dragons into battle. The dragons... Thrain paused, considering how much uncertainty he was willing to reveal. I don't know where they are now or if any still live. The chamber mentions them, but doesn't explain their current whereabouts. Finding them, or learning what happened to them, is one of the first things I need to discover. This admission of ignorance, rather than undermining his authority, seemed to make him more trustworthy in the eyes of his followers. A lord who pretended to know everything was a lord who couldn't be relied upon when real knowledge became necessary. So we're starting from the beginning, Magnus observed. Learning as we go, making mistakes as we discover what our real duties are. Exactly, Thrain agreed. And if that prospect terrifies you, you're probably smarter than the rest of us. The tension in the room broke with quiet laughter, the kind of relieved humor that came when men realized they were facing the unknown together, rather than struggling with it alone. Whatever lay ahead, whatever enemies would emerge from the shadows or descend from the mountaintops, they would meet those challenges as a unified group, rather than as individuals driven by private fears and ambitions. The first test of Thrain's new understanding came 3 days later, when a merchant caravan arrived at Ironhold's gates, bearing news that chilled the blood of every man who heard it. The traders had come from the eastern valleys, where the mining settlement of Grimhaven had vanished without explanation or survivors. Not attacked, insisted Jorik Ironbeard, the caravan's grizzled leader. Vanished. Houses standing empty, tools left where they fell, meals half-eaten on tables. As if the entire population just walked away in the middle of their daily lives. Thrain listened to the report from his seat in the great hall. The restored sword across his knees, humming with barely perceptible energy. Since his discovery of the hidden chamber, he had found himself more sensitive to undercurrents that others missed. Subtle wrongness in the air, unnatural silences that spoke of disturbances in the balance between the seen and unseen worlds. And everything about Jorik's description of Grimhaven screamed of such disturbance. How many people? Thrain asked. Near 200 souls, my lord. Miners, their families, the craftsmen who served them, all gone without a trace. Bjorn leaned forward from his place at Thrain's right hand. Raiders would have left bodies. Bandits would have taken the tools and supplies. Disease would have left the dead in their beds. Aye, Jorik agreed grimly. That's what makes it so unsettling. Whatever took them wanted the people themselves, not their possessions. Thrain felt the familiar tingle along his shoulder, where the birthmark lay hidden beneath his tunic. The sensation had grown stronger over the past few days, as if proximity to the ancient chamber was awakening capabilities that had long lain dormant. Now it pulsed with urgent warning, a rhythm that seemed to echo the beating of his heart. "Tell me about the mine itself," he said. "What were they digging for?" "Iron mostly, some silver. But Halvar, the mine foreman, He'd been sending word that they'd broken into older workings, tunnels that predated their own digging by centuries, maybe longer. The warning pulse in Thrain's shoulder intensified. Ancient workings, older than memory, beneath a settlement that had suddenly lost its entire population. The pattern was beginning to form, drawn from fragments of knowledge he had absorbed during his nights studying the chamber's inscriptions. Did anyone report strange dreams before the disappearance? Thrain asked. Nightmares, sleepwalking, people acting unlike themselves. Jorik's weathered face showed surprise at the specificity of the question. Now that you mention it, yes. My nephew Steen trades regular with Grimhaven, or did before this happened. Last time he was there, folk were complaining of bad dreams, shared nightmares about being called down into the deep places. Why do you ask? Thrain rose from his chair, the twin swords settling naturally at his sides. The knowledge he had gleaned from the ancient inscriptions was fragmentary, incomplete, but it painted a picture that filled him with growing dread. The Dragonkin had faced this threat before, had developed specific protocols for dealing with entities that fed on human consciousness and used their victims' dreams as doorways into the waking world. But those protocols required resources he didn't have, knowledge he hadn't yet fully absorbed, and powers he was only beginning to understand. Bjorn, he said quietly, select 20 of our best men. We leave for Grimhaven at first light. My lord, Jorik interrupted, I wouldn't recommend approaching that place, not until we know what happened there. The few traders willing to go near the settlement report that the very air feels wrong, like breathing in a tomb. Which is exactly why we need to investigate, Thrain replied. Some threats grow stronger when left unattended, and this has the marks of something that won't stay contained to a single settlement. As the merchant caravan settled in for the night and his men began preparations for the morning's departure, Thrain returned to the hidden chamber to search for more specific guidance. The mystical light responded to his presence immediately, flowing through the carved symbols like luminous blood through ancient veins. He found what he was looking for in a section of wall he had only briefly examined before. Detailed accounts of creatures called the Hollow Ones, beings that existed in the spaces between sleeping and waking, fed on the dreams of mortals, and could hollow out entire communities by consuming their victims' capacity for conscious thought. The descriptions matched Jorik's account with terrifying precision. The shared nightmares, the gradual erosion of individual will, the final calling that drew victims down into deep places where their essence could be more easily harvested. Left unchecked, a Hollow One could spread its influence across vast distances, creating an ever-widening circle of emptied settlements and drained souls. But the inscriptions also detailed the methods the Dragonkin had used to combat such threats. Specific rituals, particular weapons, and most importantly, the partnership with dragons whose natural resistance to dream manipulation made them ideal allies in such conflicts. Dragons that were no longer available. Thrain studied the ancient texts until exhaustion forced him to rest, his mind struggling to adapt centuries-old techniques to current limitations. When sleep finally claimed him, he dreamed of vast underground chambers filled with whispers that called his name, of shadows that moved independently of the light, and of 200 empty-eyed people walking in perfect unison towards something that waited in the darkness below. He woke with the certainty that time was running short, not just for the missing people of Grimhaven, but for everyone in the northern valleys. Dawn brought practical challenges that grounded his growing mystical awareness in immediate necessity. 20 warriors needed to be equipped for a mission whose parameters remained largely unknown. Supplies had to be selected for an expedition that might last days or weeks. Most importantly, the men needed to be prepared for dangers that went beyond conventional warfare. "What aren't you telling us?" Gunnar asked as they gathered in the armory, his experienced eye noting the unusual care Thrain was taking in weapon selection. "This isn't a rescue mission, is it?" "It's a rescue mission," Thrain replied, testing the edge of one of the ancient blades he had found in the chamber. "But the enemy isn't human, and the battleground won't be entirely in the physical world." "Meaning?" Meaning we're going to face something that attacks through dreams and nightmares, something that can influence thoughts and desires in ways that make traditional tactics useless. Thrain sheathed the blade and met Gunnar's steady gaze. I need warriors who can trust their own minds, who won't be swayed by visions or voices that promise easy answers to hard questions. Eric, who had been quietly absorbing this conversation, spoke up with the directness of youth. How do you fight something that attacks through dreams? Very carefully, Thrain said, and with weapons specifically crafted for that purpose. He gestured to the collection of ancient blades he had selected from the chamber's arsenal. Each weapon bore engravings that seemed to shift and flow in the morning light, symbols that the inscriptions identified as wards against psychic intrusion and dream manipulation. The old text described these as mind shields, he explained. Weapons that can cut through illusion and strike at the true nature of beings that exist partially outside normal reality. And you know how to use them? Bjorn asked. I'm learning, Thrain admitted. But the knowledge is there in the chamber, waiting to be understood. Each day I study the inscriptions, more pieces fall into place. And if we fail, Magnus asked with characteristic bluntness, if these hollow ones, or whatever they are, prove too strong for us? Thrain considered the question seriously before answering. Then the influence spreads, settlement by settlement, until the entire northern region is populated by empty shells controlled by something that feeds on human consciousness. Eventually, the threat would reach the southern kingdoms, the great cities, perhaps even the distant capitals. So we're not just fighting for Grimhaven, Eric observed. No, Thrain agreed. We're fighting for everyone who doesn't yet know they're in danger. As the sun climbed higher and the final preparations neared completion, Thrain found himself thinking not of the immediate mission ahead, but of the broader pattern that was beginning to emerge. The awakening of his bloodline, the discovery of his heritage, the almost immediate appearance of a threat that required specifically dragonkin knowledge to combat. These were not coincidences. Something was stirring in the deep places of the world. Something that remembered the old compacts and the power they had once held in check. His emergence as the last heir to the Dragonkin legacy had either triggered this awakening or been triggered by it. Either way, Grimhaven was likely just the beginning. The journey to Grimhaven took 2 days through mountain passes that grew increasingly unnatural as they approached their destination. What began as normal autumn weather gradually shifted into something that defied explanation, mist that moved against the wind, shadows that fell in directions that bore no relation to the sun's position, and an oppressive silence that seemed to muffle even the sound of their own footsteps. By the time they crested the final ridge overlooking the mining settlement, Thrain's birthmark was burning with constant warning, and the mind shield weapons hummed with barely contained energy. The sight that greeted them below confirmed their worst fears, while adding details that made the situation far more complex than the inscriptions had suggested. Grimhaven stood exactly as Jorik had described, houses intact, tools abandoned mid-task, meals left half-eaten on tables. But what the merchant hadn't mentioned, perhaps because he hadn't stayed long enough to observe it, was the activity that continued, despite the absence of human inhabitants. The mine operated itself. Ore carts moved along their rails with no hands to guide them, loads of stone and metal emerging from the depths in steady succession. The great water wheel that powered the settlement's machinery turned with mechanical precision, though no one remained to tend its mechanisms. Most disturbing of all, the sound of picks and hammers echoed from the mine shaft, the rhythm of organized labor continuing long after the laborers had vanished. Mother of storms, breathed Eric, his young face pale with the kind of fear that came from witnessing impossibility made manifest. The dead are still working. Not dead, Thrain corrected grimly. Worse than dead. Through the mystical awareness that had grown stronger with each passing day, he could sense the true nature of what moved in Grimhaven below. The missing people were indeed still present, but they existed now as hollow vessels, their consciousness drained away to feed something vast and hungry that dwelt in the depths beneath the settlement. Their bodies continued to function, driven by an alien intelligence that cared nothing for human needs or limitations. "What are your orders, my lord?" Bjorn asked quietly. Thrain studied the settlement through eyes that increasingly saw beyond the merely physical. The entire valley was saturated with wrongness, reality bent and twisted around a presence that treated the normal laws of existence as suggestions to be ignored when convenient. But beneath that overwhelming alien influence, he detected something else, a familiar resonance that made his heart skip with sudden hope. "There," he said, pointing toward a structure that stood apart from the mining operations. The old watchtower on the settlement's eastern edge. "Do you see it?" Bjorn squinted in the direction indicated. "I see the tower, yes. But it looks abandoned, has for years by the state of it. Look again. Not with your eyes, with your memory. Think about what a dragonkin watchtower would look like." Understanding dawned on the older warrior's weathered features. The tower's construction showed the same seamless integration of worked stone and natural rock that characterized Ironhold, the same attention to defensive positioning that marked all the ancient fortifications. And now that he knew what to look for, Bjorn could see the faded dragon motifs carved into its upper levels. "Another site," he said. "Another place the old bloodline was meant to guard, and possibly," Thrain said with growing excitement, "another sealed chamber with knowledge we desperately need." But even as hope stirred within him, the situation below deteriorated with alarming speed. The hollow-eyed workers had noticed their presence, 200 pairs of empty eyes turning skyward with mechanical precision. And from the mineshaft came a sound that made the mountain itself seem to shudder, a call that was felt rather than heard, a summoning that bypassed human ears, to resonate directly in the bones and blood of anyone who heard it. "My lord," Magnus said urgently, "we need to move, now!" The hollow workers were beginning to climb, abandoning their mechanical labor to swarm up the mountainside with the relentless efficiency of insects. But it wasn't their advance that filled Thrain with dread. It was the way the call from the depths seemed to tug at his own consciousness, whispering promises of rest and release if he would only surrender his will to the vast intelligence that dwelt below. "The watchtower," he ordered, fighting off the psychic intrusion through sheer force of will. "Whatever answers we need, they're there. Form a fighting retreat. Protect each other's minds as much as your bodies." The descent into Grimhaven became a running battle against enemies that felt no pain, knew no fear, and attacked with the coordinated precision of a single mind, controlling multiple bodies. The mind shield weapons proved their worth immediately, their edges cutting through the psychic threads that connected the hollow workers to their underground master. Each severed connection freed another tormented soul. Though whether death was a mercy or a tragedy remained an open question, Thrain led the charge toward the watchtower, his twin swords moving in patterns that seemed to come from muscle memory rather than conscious thought. The restored blade sang as it cut through the air, its edge leaving trails of blue-white light that lingered long enough to form protective barriers against the psychic assault that accompanied every physical attack. The doors sealed, Eric called out as they reached the tower's base. "Same kind of stone as Ironhold, same symbols?" "Then stand back," Thrain replied, pressing his palm against the carved dragon that marked the entrance. "Let's hope the old blood still remembers how to open old locks." The door ground open with the same mountain-shifting sound that had marked his first discovery, revealing a spiral staircase that descended into darkness, lit by the same mystical radiance that filled Ironhold's hidden chamber. But this was no repository of ancient knowledge. It was something far more precious and dangerous. At the staircase's bottom, in a chamber that pulsed with contained power, waited the answers to questions Thrain had been afraid to ask. The first was a mirror of polished black stone that showed not his reflection, but the truth of his heritage stretching back through generations of dragonkin rulers. He saw his father as a young man, tall and proud in the regalia of the last royal house. He saw his grandfather, his great-grandfather, and dozens of ancestors whose names had been lost too. History but whose bloodline had been preserved against all odds. But it was the second discovery that stole his breath and reframed everything. He thought he understood about his situation. Chained in the chambers, heart by bonds of silver and starlight, lay a dragon not dead, not sleeping, but held in a state between life and death that had preserved her through the decades since the dragonkin's fall. Her scales were the color of winter storm clouds, her eyes like captured lightning, and the moment Thrain entered the chamber, those ancient eyes fixed on him with recognition that transcended the barriers of species and time. Skofrandir, he whispered, the name rising from the depths of genetic memory. Skofrandir the Wise, last partner of the dragonkin line. The dragon's voice filled his mind without passing through his ears, carrying weight and wisdom accumulated over centuries of existence. Young king, she said, and the title carried no mockery, only patient certainty. You are late, but then the blood always awakens when the need is greatest, not when the awakening would be most convenient. The people of Grimhaven, Thrain said urgently. The Hollow Ones have taken them. Can you? I can do nothing while these chains bind me, Skofrandir replied. But you can break them if you dare accept what breaking them will mean. What will it mean? It will mean the end of your quiet life as a simple lord of a simple fortress, the dragon said, with something that might have been gentle amusement. It will mean accepting fully the heritage you have only begun to understand. It will mean becoming what your bloodline has always been meant to be, the bridge between human and dragon, the guardian of balances that most mortals never even know exist. Above them, the sounds of battle grew closer as Thrain's men fought a desperate holding action against enemies that could not be killed by conventional means. Time was running out, both for the immediate crisis and for the larger threat that the Hollow Ones represented. The choice is yours, Skofrandir continued. Free me, and together we can face what comes next as our ancestors did, as partners in the great work of keeping the world from sliding into darkness. Refuse, and watch as the influence spreads beyond any single settlement, beyond any single region, until all human consciousness serves the hunger that dwells in the deep places. Thrain looked at the chains that bound the dragon, seeing now that they were not imprisonments but protections, barriers that had kept both dragon and partnership hidden until the day when both would be needed again. Breaking them would announce to every power in the world that the dragonkin had returned, that the old compacts were active once more. It would also paint a target on his back that would never fade. But as the psychic assault from the mine intensified, and the sounds of his men's struggle grew more desperate, Thrain realized he had never really had a choice at all. The moment he had opened the first sealed door, the moment he had accepted his heritage, this confrontation had become inevitable. He reached for the chains with hands that no longer trembled, ready to embrace a destiny he was finally prepared to claim. Thrain's hands closed around the first chain, and the moment his skin touched the silver and starlight bonds, knowledge flooded through him like a dam bursting after years of pressure. Not the gradual understanding he had gained from studying the inscriptions, but the immediate, overwhelming awareness that came from direct contact with draconic magic that had been waiting decades for his touch. He saw the truth of the dragonkin's fall, not defeat in battle or gradual decline, but deliberate sacrifice. His father had not abandoned him out of cruelty or weakness, but had given up everything, including his own life, to ensure that the bloodline would survive, hidden until the time came for it to emerge stronger than before. The chains that bound Skofrandir were not just protections, but a chrysalis, a magical cocoon that had preserved both dragon and partnership through the dark years, when enemies of the old compact had sought to destroy every trace of what had once been. Your father was wise. Skofrandir's voice whispered in his mind as the first chain began to dissolve under his touch. He knew that open resistance would only ensure complete destruction. Better to appear defeated while ensuring eventual victory. The chamber filled with light as each chain fell away, not the gentle blue-white radiance of the wall inscriptions, but something brighter and more alive, the luminescence of power that had been compressed and concentrated for so long that its release was almost violent in intensity. Above them, the sounds of battle shifted as the Hollow One's influence wavered under the pressure of awakening draconic presence. But even as hope stirred within him, Thrain felt the weight of what he was unleashing. Every major power in the known world would sense this awakening, would understand that the ancient bloodline had returned not as a shadow of its former glory, but as something potentially stronger than it had ever been. Enemies who had spent generations congratulating themselves on the Dragonkin's extinction would now scramble to assess this new threat. Allies who had made accommodations with the current order of things would be forced to choose sides in conflicts they had hoped were safely buried in the past. "The moment these chains fall completely," he said aloud, partly for Skofrandir's benefit, but mostly to organize his own thoughts. "We become targets for every ambitious warlord, every power-hungry sorcerer, and every ancient enemy who remembers what the Dragonkin represented." Yes, the dragon agreed with calm certainty. "And that is why we must be ready not just to defend ourselves, but to take the initiative in re-establishing the old balances. The Hollow Ones are not the only threat that has grown bold in our absence. There are things stirring in the deep places, powers awakening that have slumbered since the first compact was made. If we react to events rather than shaping them, we will find ourselves overwhelmed before we can fully reclaim our strength." The last chain dissolved, and Skofrandir rose from the chamber floor with a grace that defied her enormous size. Fully extended, she was larger than Thrain had expected. Not quite the mountain-sized beast of children's tales, but massive enough that her presence filled the chamber completely. Her storm-cloud scales rippled with inner lightning, and when she spread her wings, the air itself seemed to thicken with barely contained power. "It has been too long since I felt the wind beneath my wings," she said, and this time her voice carried undertones of joy that made Thrain's heart soar with sympathetic emotion. "But first, we have immediate concerns to address." Through the psychic connection that was rapidly strengthening between them, Thrain could sense the full scope of the threat they faced. The Hollow One that had taken Grimhaven was vast and ancient, but it was not alone. Similar entities were stirring throughout the northern regions, drawn by the scent of unprotected human settlements and the weakness that had spread in the absence of proper guardianship. Left unchecked, they would create a cascade of emptied villages and drained communities that would eventually threaten the stability of entire kingdoms. But now, with Skofrandir's power joined to his own awakening abilities, they had the means to fight back effectively. The dragon's natural resistance to psychic manipulation would protect both of them from the Hollow One's primary weapon, while her physical might and his inherited knowledge would provide the tools needed to sever the entity's connection to the physical world permanently. "The others," Thrain said suddenly, remembering his men who were still fighting desperately above. "My warriors are holding their own better than you might expect," Skofrandir assured him. "The mind shield weapons you selected are working as designed, and the proximity of my awakening power is disrupting the Hollow One's control over its servants. But we should move quickly. The longer this confrontation continues, the more likely it becomes that other threats will take notice and move to exploit the chaos." They emerged from the watchtower into a battle that had transformed completely from the desperate retreat it had been moments before. Thrain's men were no longer fighting, hollow-eyed automatons, but confused and frightened, people who were gradually remembering who they were, as the psychic threads connecting them to their underground captor were severed one by one. The mind shield weapons were living up to their reputation, cutting through mental bondage as effectively as they severed physical threats. But the real change was in the mine itself. What had been a steady industrial operation was now chaos, as the Hollow One below struggled to maintain control over a situation that was rapidly slipping beyond its ability to manage. Ore carts derailed and overturned. Machinery ground to a halt as the alien intelligence that had been operating it was forced to focus its attention on defending itself against the awakening power above. "Bjorn!" Thrain called out as he spotted his second-in-command, helping a dazed miner to his feet. "Get everyone clear of the mine entrance. What we're about to do is going to make the mountain itself shake." The older warrior took one look at the dragon emerging behind Thrain and nodded with the kind of calm acceptance that came from years of following, orders that seemed impossible until they were carried out successfully. "You heard him," Bjorn bellowed to the assembled warriors and rescued civilians. "Clear the area. Give our lord and his partner room to work." As the crowd moved to a safe distance, Thrain felt the full weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. This would be his first true test as a dragonkin, his first opportunity to prove that the awakened bloodline could indeed fulfill the responsibilities that came with its power. Success would establish his credibility, not just with his own men, but with anyone who witnessed or heard tales of what happened here. Failure would likely mean not just his own death, but the loss of the last hope for re-establishing the ancient guardianship that kept the world's darker powers in check. "Are you ready?" Skvrandir asked, her mental voice carrying undertones of anticipation and grim satisfaction. "This will not be like the practice battles described in the old texts. The Hollow One below is fully mature, experienced in combat, and desperate enough to use techniques that could damage the mountain itself in its efforts to destroy us." Thrain drew both swords, feeling the restored blade pulse with eager energy while its twin hummed in harmony. The birthmark on his shoulder blazed with heat that was almost painful, but beneath the discomfort lay a sense of completion he had never experienced before. For the first time in his life, he felt truly whole, not just a broken man carrying a broken sword, but the heir to a legacy that stretched back to the first partnership between human and dragon. "I'm ready," he said, and meant it completely. Together, they descended into the mine shaft, leaving behind the familiar world of human concerns and entering a realm where the rules that governed normal existence became suggestions that could be ignored by beings with sufficient will and power. The walls of the tunnel pulsed with unnatural light, and the air itself seemed thick with malevolent presence that pressed against their minds like a physical weight. But they pressed on, dragon and human united in purpose as their ancestors had been, moving toward a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of Grimhaven's people, but the future of the ancient compact that had once kept the world's balance intact. Behind them, the Thrain's men waited with the rescued civilians, watching the mine entrance for signs of their lord's success or failure. The mountain trembled with barely contained forces, and in the distance, other powers began to take notice of the disturbance that announced the return of something they had hoped was gone forever. The real battle was about to begin, and its outcome would echo through the northern lands and beyond, reshaping the balance of power that had remained stable for 3 generations. Whether that reshaping would benefit the cause of order and protection, or plunge the region into chaos and destruction, depended entirely on the strength of a partnership that was only now being truly tested for the first time. In the depths below, something vast and hungry waited with patience born of eons, confident that no single human and dragon could stand against power that had been growing unchecked since the last dragonkin fell. It had consumed the dreams and consciousness of thousands, had absorbed the life force of entire communities, and had grown strong enough to challenge even the ancient bonds that once held its kind in check. But it had never faced a dragonkin who carried the concentrated heritage of his entire bloodline, partnered with a dragon who had spent decades in magical stasis, dreaming of vengeance against the forces that had driven them into hiding. The final confrontation was about to test whether legend could indeed become reality once more. The mineshaft descended, far deeper than any natural excavation should have reached, tunneling through layers of rock that predated human civilization by millennia. As Thrain and Skofrandir moved through passages that grew increasingly unnatural with each step, the walls themselves began to pulse with veins of sickly luminescence that hurt to look at directly. "The Hollow One has been reshaping reality down here," Skofrandir observed, her mental voice carrying notes of disgust and professional interest. Impressive work for a creature of its type. Crude, but effective. They had moved beyond the worked stone of human mining into chambers that defied geometric logic, spaces that were simultaneously too large and too small, where the ceiling seemed to stretch toward impossible heights while pressing down with crushing weight. The air tasted of copper and despair, thick with the psychic residue of 200 drained souls and whatever the entity below had done with their captured consciousness. "There," Thrain said, pointing toward a passage that glowed with particularly intense wrongness. "The main chamber is through there." He knew this not through any map or guidance, but through the growing certainty that came from his awakened bloodline. The dragonkin had faced these creatures before, had developed instincts for tracking them to their lairs and understanding their methods of operation. That inherited knowledge whispered warnings about what they would find ahead, a hollow one in its place of power, surrounded by the crystallized essence of its victims' stolen dreams. They emerged into a cavern that had been carved not by tools, but by will alone, its walls shaped into spiraling patterns that drew the eye inward toward the chamber's heart. There, suspended in a web of psychic energy that glowed with nauseating colors, hung the accumulated consciousness of Grimhaven's entire population. 200 souls trapped in crystalline structures that pulsed with their owners' final thoughts, their last hopes, their dying fears, and feeding on that trapped essence was the Hollow One itself. The creature was less a single entity than a collection of hungers given form and purpose. It shifted constantly, sometimes appearing as a writhing mass of shadow and malice, sometimes taking on the half-remembered shapes of its victims' nightmares. But beneath the changing facade lay something old and patient and utterly alien, a consciousness that regarded human awareness as nothing more than food to be harvested and consumed. "Young dragonkin," the Hollow One spoke without voice, its words bypassing ears to resonate directly in mind and bone. "You arrived just in time to witness the completion of my work. Soon, these stored essences will provide the power I need to extend my influence throughout these mountains. Every settlement, every village, every thinking creature will serve as sustenance for my eternal hunger." "Not while I draw breath," Thrain replied, his twin swords beginning to glow with the same blue-white radiance that had filled the ancient chambers. "And not while the compact between dragon and human stands renewed." The Hollow One's laughter was the sound of hope dying, of dreams crumbling into dust. "The compact is broken, young fool. Has been broken for generations. You are the last of a failed bloodline, partnered with a creature too weak to maintain the bindings that once held my kind in check." "Then let us test that theory," Skofrandir said, and launched herself forward with speed that turned her, storm cloud bulk, into a blur of motion and controlled. Fury, the battle that erupted in the chamber's heart, was unlike anything Thrain had experienced in his years as a warrior. This was not a contest of steel against steel, but a conflict that played out simultaneously on multiple levels of reality. Physical attacks were accompanied by psychic assaults that sought to shatter the defender's sense of self, while the very air around them became a weapon as the Hollow One manipulated the chamber's twisted geometry to create killing fields of warped space and Skofrandir's natural resistance to mental manipulation proved invaluable as she weathered attacks that would have driven a human consciousness to madness. Her claws and teeth found purchase on the Hollow One's shifting form, tearing away chunks of materialized hunger that screamed as they dissolved back into component malice. But for every wound she inflicted, the creature drew upon its stored victims to heal itself. their trapped essence providing the power needed to continue the fight. Thrain found himself dancing between physical and metaphysical combat, his inherited knowledge guiding him through techniques that had been perfected over centuries of guardian service. The mind shield swords proved their worth, their edges cutting through psychic attacks, while their presence disrupted the Hollow One's control over its crystallized victims. Each successful strike weakened the bonds holding the trapped consciousness, causing individual crystals to crack and release wisps of liberated awareness. But the Hollow One was adapting, learning from their attacks and adjusting its defenses accordingly. What had begun as a straightforward confrontation was evolving into a battle of attrition that favored the creature with access to 200 stolen souls' worth of stored power. The crystals. Thrain called out to Skövrandir as he barely dodged a psychic lance that would have scrambled his thoughts beyond recovery. We need to free the trapped consciousness directly. As long as it can draw on their essence, it's too strong to defeat conventionally. Agreed, the dragon replied, but reaching them requires getting past its primary defenses. And those defenses are designed specifically to counter dragonkin tactics. The truth of her words became apparent as they pressed their attack toward the chamber's heart, where the crystallized souls hung like obscene fruit on the tree of the Hollow One's power. Every step forward was contested by increasingly desperate attacks, reality itself bending around them as the creature fought to maintain control over its harvested victims. The turning point came when Thrain realized that conventional tactics, even enhanced by dragon partnership and ancient weapons, were insufficient for this battle. The Hollow One had been preparing for the return of the dragonkin for decades, had studied their methods and developed countermeasures that neutralized their traditional advantages. Victory would require something new, something that combined the old wisdom with innovations born from necessity. "Skövrandir," he called out as another wave of psychic assault crashed over them. The crystals aren't just prisons, they're conduits. The creature is using the victim's own consciousness to power its defenses against us. Then we turn that strength into weakness. The dragon replied with grim understanding. But it will require perfect synchronization between us and acceptance of considerable risk. Thrain understood immediately what she was proposing. Instead of fighting the Hollow One's control over the crystallized souls, they would join their consciousness to that network, not as victims, but as liberators, working from within the psychic matrix that held 200 minds in bondage. It was a technique that existed in the ancient texts only as theoretical possibility, something attempted perhaps twice in the entire history of the dragonkin bloodline. Both previous attempts had resulted in the permanent loss of the dragon-human partnership involved. "The risk is acceptable," Thrain said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "These people trusted their lives to forces beyond their understanding. The least we can do is risk ours to set them free." Without further discussion, both warriors ceased their physical attacks and instead opened their minds to the psychic web that connected every crystallized soul in the chamber. The sensation was like diving into a lake of liquid nightmare, consciousness flooding through pathways that human awareness was never meant to travel. For a terrifying moment, Thrain felt his sense of self beginning to dissolve as 200 different personalities pressed against his mental barriers. But then Skövrandir's presence steadied him, her ancient mind serving as an anchor point around which his human consciousness could organize itself. Together, they moved through the network of trapped souls, like healers moving through a plague ward, touching each imprisoned mind with the promise of freedom, while carefully avoiding the psychic traps the Hollow One had woven throughout its domain. "Who are you?" The first voice they encountered belonged to Halvar, the mine foreman whose curiosity about the ancient workings had begun this tragedy. His consciousness had been among the first taken, and consequently was most deeply integrated into the Hollow One's power structure. "Friends," Thrain replied, his mental voice carrying all the authority of his awakened bloodline. "We've come to take you home." Home is gone, another voice whispered, a woman named Astrid, whose final thoughts had been of her children playing safely in their garden. We are part of something larger now, something that will never let us go. Then we'll make it let you go, Skofrandir said with dragon certainty. No creature of shadow and hunger can stand against the combined will of free minds choosing their own destiny. Working together, they began the delicate process of severing the connections that bound each consciousness to the Hollow One's web. It was like performing surgery with tools made of pure will, requiring precise cuts that freed the victim without damaging their essential identity. Each successful liberation weakened the creature's power base, but also increased its desperation and the violence of its attempts to maintain control. The Hollow One's response was immediate and devastating. Reality convulsed around them as the creature poured centuries of accumulated malice into one final assault, attempting to crush both liberators and victims in a psychic implosion that would leave it the sole consciousness remaining in the chamber. The walls of the cavern began to collapse, not from physical stress, but from the breakdown of the modified reality that had shaped them. But its desperation also created the opening Thrain had been waiting for. As the Hollow One committed all its resources to one massive attack, it left its core essence momentarily unguarded, the central hunger that defined its existence and gave it purpose. With movements that felt more like dance than combat, he slipped through its defenses and struck at the creature's heart with both mind shield swords. The blades, forged specifically to combat entities that existed partially outside normal reality, found their mark with devastating effect. The Hollow One's scream echoed not just through the chamber but across multiple planes of existence, a wail of frustrated hunger that marked the end of its long predation on human consciousness. As the creature's control collapsed, the crystallized souls began to dissolve back into their component consciousness. 200 minds suddenly free to remember who they were and what had been done to them. The chamber filled with the sound of actual voices as people materialized from the psychic matrix. Whole and unharmed despite their ordeal, "My lord," Halvar said as he materialized near the chamber's entrance, his weathered face showing awe mixed with gratitude. "We remember everything, the dreams, the calling, the emptiness, but also the light, the warmth of minds that refused to abandon us to darkness." Thrain helped the Mind Foreman to his feet, feeling the satisfying weight of a task completed and a responsibility fulfilled. Around them, families reunited with tears of joy, while Skofrandir's gentle presence provided reassurance to those still struggling with the transition from captivity to freedom. The first test of the renewed Dragonkin partnership had been passed, but as they prepared to lead the rescued people back to the surface, both dragon and human knew that this victory was only the beginning of much larger challenges ahead. 3 months after the liberation of Grimhaven, Thrain stood once again on the battlements of Ironhold, but the view that greeted him was vastly different from the one he had contemplated as a simple mercenary lord. The fortress itself had been transformed, its ancient chambers restored to their original purpose as a center of guardian operations. Dragonflight platforms carved into the mountainside accommodated Skofrandir's need for aerial reconnaissance, while the Great Hall had been reconfigured to serve both human warriors and the steady stream of messengers who now arrived daily from across the northern regions. Word of the Dragonkin's return had indeed spread exactly as they had anticipated, bringing both opportunities and challenges that tested every lesson learned in those first desperate weeks of awakening. Some responses had been gratifying, villages requesting protection from supernatural threats, young warriors seeking to join the renewed guardian service, and scholars arriving with ancient texts that had been hidden away for generations. Others had been more troubling: assassination attempts from unnamed enemies, political maneuvering by regional lords who saw the Dragonkin as either tools to be used or threats to be eliminated, and increasingly frequent reports of other ancient powers stirring in response to the partnership's renewal. But perhaps the most significant change was in Thrain himself. The uncertain mercenary who had once questioned his own worth had grown into a leader who commanded respect through demonstrated capability rather than inherited title. The twin swords at his sides no longer felt like foreign objects, but natural extensions of his will, while the birthmark that had once seemed like a random quirk of nature now served as a constant reminder of responsibilities that stretched far beyond personal survival. The morning reports, Bjorn said, as he approached with a leather portfolio containing the latest intelligence from their growing network of allies and informants. At 57, the veteran warrior had adapted to his new role as chief administrator with the same pragmatic efficiency that had made him invaluable as a second-in-command. 3 more villages requesting guardian protection, 2 offers of alliance from southern lords, and 1 rather interesting message from someone claiming to represent the dragonkin of the eastern mountains. This last item caught Thrain's attention immediately. In all their studies of the ancient texts, they had found references to other branches of the bloodline, other human-dragon partnerships that had operated in different regions before the Great Extinction. The possibility that some had survived in hiding, as Skofrandir had, represented both tremendous opportunity and significant complication. Eastern mountains, he mused. That would be the Thornspike range, where the old texts mention the partnership between Jorek Stormcaller and Nethys the Flameheart, the same region where strange lights have been reported in the sky for the past month, Bjorn noted. Lights that move against the wind and appear to respond to human presence. Dragons testing the air, Skofrandir observed as she landed on the flight platform with the controlled grace that never failed to impress human observers. Determining whether it is safe to reveal themselves after so many years of hiding. Her presence had become as natural a part of Ironhold's daily routine as sunrise and sunset, though Thrain suspected he would never entirely lose the sense of wonder that came from partnering with a creature whose memories stretched back centuries. Through their deepened mental connection, he had experienced fragments of the world as it had existed. During the height of the Dragonkin era, a time when the partnership between human innovation and draconic wisdom had created protections and balances that most people now remembered only as legend. What's your assessment? Thrain asked. Are we ready to make contact with other survivors? The question is whether they are ready to make contact with us, Skofrandir replied thoughtfully. Our actions at Grimhaven announced our presence to every power in the known world. Some of our surviving kin may see that as premature, an unnecessary risk that endangers their own carefully maintained concealment, and others may see it as proof that the time for hiding is past, Thrain countered. That the threats we face are too large for any single partnership to handle alone. It was an ongoing debate that had occupied many of their evening discussions. The ancient texts spoke of the Dragonkin as a network of allied partnerships, each responsible for their own region, but coordinated in their efforts to maintain larger balances. Recreating that network from the scattered survivors of the original extinction would require delicate diplomacy, shared purpose, and probably more than a little luck. There's another consideration, Bjorn interjected with the bluntness that had always characterized his counsel. The people we've committed to protecting. 36 villages now look to Ironhold for guardian services, and more request our aid every week. We can't abandon those responsibilities to chase shadows in distant mountains, nor can we ignore the possibility of rebuilding something larger than any individual partnership, Thrain replied. The Hollow One at Grimhaven was just one threat among many. The texts described things far worse stirring in the deep places. Entities that would require coordinated response from multiple dragon-human partnerships to contain effectively. As if summoned by their discussion of larger threats, a messenger arrived from the southern approaches. A young woman, whose exhausted horse and travel-stained clothes spoke of desperate urgency. Her message was brief but troubling. Strange disappearances in the coastal settlements. Entire fishing fleets vanishing without trace. and reports of lights beneath the water that called to people in their dreams. Another ancient hunger awakening, Skavrandir observed grimly. The pattern is beginning to establish itself. Our success at Grimhaven has encouraged other trapped entities to test their bonds, to probe for weaknesses in the barriers that have contained them. Then we answer the call, Thrain said simply. As we did before, as we'll continue to do until the old balances are restored. The certainty in his voice reflected a transformation that went beyond personal growth into something approaching destiny fulfilled. The poor giant who had once believed himself worth nothing had discovered not just his heritage, but his purpose. The broken sword that had symbolized abandonment and failure now served as a reminder that even shattered things could be made whole again, stronger for having been tested by adversity. As the sun set over the mountains that had become his true home, Thrain reflected on the journey that had brought him from desperate mercenary to guardian of ancient compacts. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats that required the partnership between human will and draconic wisdom to address. But tonight, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, he was exactly where he belonged, doing exactly what he was meant to do. The bloodline lived. The compact was renewed, and the balance between order and chaos had guardians once more.